Hello everyone, this is Ulken on Kazakh TV. When COVID-19 pandemic spread around the world, the time of brave people came. Medical workers, law enforcement agencies, military people, media, all of them are now at the forefront of the fight against the coronavirus. Today's program is dedicated to those who were brave enough to stand between us and the pandemic, heroes of the COVID-19 fight. Do people now think differently of ambulance doctors?
Their opinions have changed completely. Everyone now knows what intensive care is.
Have any of your colleagues been infected with the coronavirus?
Of course, it happens to all mortals. We are human too.
We tried not to show anything. Our first guest today, emergency doctor Ulken kızı. Please welcome. Hello there.
Ulken Kaldыбек, graduated from Asfendiyarov Kazakh National Medical University. Doctor, currently doing her residency in pulmonology at her alma mater. Works at number 2 emergency services station.
Ulken, how long does it take you to suit up? Well, the minimum time I spent is like 5 minutes. You know, we don't have the luxury of time. If someone calls the ambulance, we must get dressed and leave the station in 5 minutes. As far as I know, it's more difficult to take it off rather than to put it on. It is difficult to take it off because we are constantly in contact with COVID-19 positive patients. So whenever we take them off, we always risk getting infected. Basically, there is a special protocol of how we should take these protective suits off. First of all, it is a must that after the protective suit is taken off, it should be immersed and soaked in a special solution. So it's always a challenge to take those things off. When you put on a new clean protective suit, it's easier. So how many layers does it consist of? This is personal protective gear. We have something like pajamas inside. We put on a coat over the pajamas, and then there is this apron. So basically we can say it has 3 layers. And what about your head? We have 3 layers on our heads too. The first one is a band that I put on my head. Then there is a hood, also a face mask, and then one more. Last but not least, goggles. Overall, we wear 2 masks and 1 pair of goggles. There are photos on social networks featuring doctors with bruises on their faces that they got because of the masks. Does it happen? It does, absolutely, because in infectious hospitals, medical workers wear protective clothes for 6-12 hours. It's only natural that these masks leave marks and bruises. Sometimes even injuries can happen. Imagine wearing a mask for 6-12 hours without taking it off. Did it happen to you personally? Well, it takes us a maximum of 3 hours to transport a patient to the hospital. I mean, from the moment we get in contact with the patient and until he's transported to the hospital. So we don't get such injuries. So since you always wear this protective clothes, obviously it blocks any fresh air. So can this lead to any kind of skin conditions, allergies? Have this ever happened to you? It might cause an allergy, but the probability of it depends on how a person's body will react. There are also videos on social media showing doctors who are swearing when they take off their protective suits. In those videos, they're soaking wet. Is it true? It is true. After all, we wear 1 layer of clothes every day. Here we have to wear 3 layers of clothes. The apron is made of polyethylene, for instance. It is completely airtight. Therefore, it's true that some people can sweat and feel discomfort. And then it's also said that these doctors who wear those costumes for 6-7 hours straight can even find time to eat. It's impossible to eat because we're not allowed to take off a suit and put it on again in an hour or 2. After all, we constantly monitor our patients, every hour, every 2 hours. So we don't have time or opportunity to take our suits off and put them back on whenever we want. What a dedication, what a courage. Now let us watch the video feature about an ambulance worker that was made by our editor. We will get back to our studio once we finish. We have more guests joining us today.
I have been working for the ambulance services for more than 10 years now. There were many different events in those 10 years.
Алар болды, ол әрине.
Of course, there are pros and cons in this work.
Енді жаман жағына кейбір кезде негативтар да болады.
On the downside, negative things happen sometimes.
Бірден өршіп кетті, бастап кеттік, қызық, вызов көп.
Like, when the virus has spread like fire. So it was a very new challenge for us.
Маған біздің практикада мынандай киімдерді киіп, бірінші жүру.
There was a lot of work, there were many calls. And of course, first of all, you have to suit up properly. And talking of these clothes, we have never experienced anything like this pandemic in our practice. Wearing this protective gear, when you work, you sweat a lot. But it seemed that finally people have started understanding our worth. They treat us with profound respect, even when you are just walking down the street.
Келіп, орысша сөйледі енді. Мне плохо.
One day we were all here at our emergency station. An old man, about 45-50 years old, came right here and said in Russian, "I feel bad." This happened exactly at our station.
Дәрігерлер бар, бәріміз енді бір адамдай ретінде.
So he said that and immediately fainted. It was a coma. We all jumped up, put him on a stretcher, called doctors. So basically, we saved his life.
Жаңағыдай интубациясын жасап, оған
He experienced clinical death for like 7-8 minutes.
осы этап кезінде алып алдық та, дер кезінде.
His heart stopped. He stopped breathing. It seemed like he was about to die.
Аны өмірден шығарып алдық та, сөйтіп.
So we performed a tracheotomy on him. We hooked him to that oxygen machine, We did everything good. We delivered him to the hospital where doctors took good care of him. We saved his life. He made it. And then, in a month or two after what happened, we see him again. We instantly recognized him.
Енді келгенде біз таныдық примерно.
One always expects only the best from a fellow man, so we thought he came to say thank you. However, on the contrary, he came to file a complaint. He wanted to complain about us. Can you imagine? We were all astonished. What happened? So the man then explained. It turned out that when we hooked him up to that oxygen machine, and had to because he didn't breathe and needed lungs ventilation, his brain was about to die. So while we were hooking him up to that device, we broke his front tooth.
Сол алып атқан кезде ол
And that was the reason he decided to come and file a complaint.
кеткен екен.
He wanted to complain about us who broke his tooth. Can you imagine?
Деп жалып айтып кетті.
So you see, we have to deal with all kinds of people here.
Қандай деп. Енді біз
Young and old, children and elderly, everyone.
нәрестеден бастап үлкен кісілерге дейін.
14.
Brigade 14, Brigade 14. Askana, first category call.
Бірінші категориялық шақырту.
Көбіне үлкен адам.
The elderly people now call more and more. And the thing is, you never know what kind of patient is calling, how serious his condition is, because obviously it is a phone call, so you never know. Some patients end up taking PCR test and CT scan just to make sure what has happened to them. According to the protocol, these patients are supposed to be transported to COVID-19 hospitals and infectious disease hospitals in a timely manner. Of course, this coronavirus pandemic was a challenge for the whole world, not only for our country. We were really frightened when we heard about the first cases of COVID-19 that appeared in China. Not only ordinary people, but also the medical workers were paralyzed with the fear at first. We were terrified indeed. There were like hundreds of questions on our minds. How do we get home? We have parents at home. We have children. Can we infect them? What if they get sick? Of course, we all had that sense of fear every day on a daily basis.
әрине қорқыныш сезім болды.
Some of my colleagues decided to rent flats and not to return home.
Өздері
There were all kinds of situations. You have no idea. No one was ready for this pandemic. But against all odds, despite the pandemic, this is the profession that I chose with my whole heart. I chose medicine. This is something I am committed to wholeheartedly. I love my profession, and I'm always ready to serve my people.
While we were watching the video feature, another guest joined our studio. This is an ambulance doctor, Biknur Yersanova. Welcome, Biknur.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Beknur Amanjol graduated from Asfendiarov Kazakh National Medical University, general practitioner, currently doing his residency in intensive care and anesthesiology at his alma mater, works at number 2 emergency services station.
Beknur, we have just watched the video, and now it's more obvious than ever that your work is definitely not an easy one. Why have you once decided to become an ambulance doctor?
Well, as a future intensive care doctor, as a future anesthesiologist, I firmly believe that every single doctor should start his career in an ambulance crew. Because you see, I think that working with the ambulance crew is a great opportunity for any doctor to become very sharp, to learn how to make right, accurate and precise decisions. Also, it is great for gaining practical experience and developing psychological strength.
Thank you, Beknur. Well, now, Akjarkın. What about you? As you have said earlier, it takes courage and dedication to take off those clothes, to work in those clothes. Well, I wanted to work as an ambulance doctor to, first and foremost, improve my knowledge, and secondly, in order to gain this practical and relevant experience. I really believe that ambulances are a great place to learn. It's a steep learning curve. Ambulance doctors are people who have to think quickly and efficiently under serious time pressure. When people ask me what motivates me, I think it's the opportunity to think 2-3 steps in advance, and also the opportunity to help our patients, to see their joy, to receive their family's gratitude. This is the reason I chose the ambulance, to bring joy to my patients. But of course, there is not only gratitude, right? Some people might be frustrated too. Of course, there are some moments when people who called us can be sad, cross, or frustrated. When we can't make it on time, when there are too many calls, when we can't provide the services that patients want, they get frustrated. Sometimes they file complaints. There were such cases in my practice. I came here for nothing. Do you ever think this to yourself in such cases? No, I never think so. Because before I will get my job, I have to pass this test. After all the doctors, all the medical workers know how harsh and severe this work can be. How difficult it is to work in an ambulance, and how humbling it might be. You will never know this before you join the ambulance. Beknur, do you think that people now think differently of the ambulance doctors? Their attitude has changed during this pandemic.
Absolutely. It has changed once and for all. This is my opinion.
How do you know this?
Well, if before the state of emergency and quarantine were declared, the usual number of daily calls we received was like 10, 15, maybe 20 sometimes. Then, after the introduction of the state of emergency, after the introduction of the quarantine regime, the number of calls increased several times.
Probably there were many times when people couldn't reach the ambulance dispatchers.
Of course, there were many such cases. This is exactly why those special ambulance stations have been set up. Initially, you know, the city was on a total lockdown. After the posts were put up, of course, the number of calls were relatively small. And then, when the posts were removed and the quarantine regime was eased, the number of calls increased twice. And the load on the ambulance also doubled. It was extremely difficult. At the same time, due to the huge number of calls, the time intervals for the first aid provision to patients were extended. That is why we were late for many calls, because of the whole situation. Most often, patients were understanding and kind. After all, on the one hand, any doctor working in the ambulance team must be physically, psychologically and theoretically ready for anything. Anything can happen during the call, you know? In many cases, we have to provide psychological assistance to patients' relatives, you know, or to the patients themselves. We do lots of explanations too. Many problems can be solved when we visit our patients.
Akjarkın, how many hours per day do you usually work? We work around the clock every day. Our shifts can be 24 hours long. We then can rest for 3 days, but only if our shift was 24 hours long. What was it like to work during the pandemic? Even during the pandemic, our shifts were still long because we can't just set a schedule of our own choice. After all, we have this fixed schedule, 24 hours long shifts. This is how we work. During the pandemic, of course, when there was a shortage of oxygen machines, a shortage of medical personnel, we had to work extra hours. It was brutal, but that is something we do, and that's how we work during the pandemic. Were you paid extra for your extra hours?
Yes, of course. After all, the Ministry of Health has divided all medical workers into 3 categories. Those who were eligible for extra bonuses. We belong to the second category of medical workers, so we received a bonus of 425,000 tenge.
Көлемінде толық үстемақы алып отырдық.
This is great. Well, now, Biknur, what happens when you see that a patient that you transport in your ambulance is about to die? Do you have to make the decision to help him on your own? What do you do in such cases?
Of course, situations like these occur on the daily duty of any doctor who works in the ambulance team. After all, we do not choose the calls ourselves. Anything can get out of control, anything can happen when we come to our patients, when we come for their call. Therefore, there are many such cases happening all the time. For example, during the quarantine, during the coronavirus pandemic, there was one call from a 60-year-old woman who called an ambulance because of respiratory failure. When we arrived, we came to the conclusion that the patient, the woman, was unconscious. She was suffocating. She experienced shortness of breath and panic. Relatives were really stressed out psychologically.
So she started panicking.
It was a very stressful situation for them, since the woman had so many underlying health conditions: coronary heart disease, blood pressure issues, diabetes, and on the top of that, based on the result of PCR analysis and computed tomography, we made a predictive diagnosis during that call.
ПЦР анализ нәтижесі және
She had coronavirus infection complicated by pneumonia, polysegmental bilateral pneumonia, and she had a severe respiratory failure too. At that point, it was necessary to provide emergency assistance,
екі жақты пневмония деп аталады. Және де ауыр
meaning that according to the protocol, there was a certain sequence.
көмек көрсету керек. Яғни алгоритм бойынша белгілі бір реттілікпен.
As she survived.
Of course, so since she had a low oxygen saturation, her oxygen volume was around 30%, her blood pressure was below 60 millimeters. Can you imagine?
Бұл кезде тез шешім қабылдау.
So in that case, we had to decide, and we had to decide fast. Well, in such cases, a tracheotomy has to be performed. In some patients, it can be difficult to find blood vessels, so in such cases, a catheter is placed in a large vein of a central venous system. After these resuscitation manipulations, the patient was connected to an artificial lungs ventilator and then transported to the intensive care unit of a modular infectious disease hospital.
қосылып, модульді инфекциялық ауруханаға жансақтау бөліміне тасымалданды.
Biknur, when things like this happen, they can be scared and worried relatives and family members. At that time, how do you manage to focus on helping your patient without being distracted by anyone? And where do you get moral strength for this? How can you possibly cope when you hear people crying? How do you contain yourself?
Жоқ,
Well, you see, I am never alone. After all, I am a doctor of the intensive care team, so there are always 2 paramedics accompanying me, and there is also a driver in the team. Now, whenever I work with a patient, one of the paramedics would do the explanations, comfort relatives, and so on. And the doctor, me, and another paramedic, we are providing the first aid. So usually, there are no problems.
сондықтан еш қиын болмайды.
Akjarkhan, now as an ambulance doctor, it's up to you to decide whether the patient needs to be admitted into the hospital or not. Do you decide it when you come for a call? Well, the patient is usually supposed to be transported to the hospital according to the criteria approved by the Ministry of Healthcare. We divide these cases of emergency admission into 3 categories: mild, moderate, and severe. The category is appointed after an objective examination of the patient's condition. If his or her condition is mild, then the patient can stay at home. If their condition is moderate or severe, can be evaluated on the following 4 criteria. First of all, the body temperature. If it has been above 38.5 degrees for 3 days, and if the patient's respiratory failure lasts between 26 seconds to 1 minute, then if the level of oxygen in the blood, so-called oxygen saturation, is 93% lower, and the 4th criteria is if the patient did a CT scan of his lungs, which showed signs of lung damage from 50% to 75%, then this patient is considered to be in a moderate health condition and requires admission. According to the 3rd criteria, critically ill patients can be defined. These are the patients whose body temperature remains at 38.5 degrees for 5 or more days, whose oxygen levels are 90% and lower, and finally those whose CT scans have shown more than 75% lung damage. In addition, if the respiratory failure is severe, meaning if those patients breathe more frequently than 26 inhales/exhales per minute, they require urgent transportation to the hospital. This is the protocol we work with. And this protocol is the same throughout Kazakhstan. It's not only for the city of Almaty, but for the whole country. I see now, thank you. Biknur, we know that when this coronavirus pandemic happened, there were people who were admitted into hospitals because they were infected with the coronavirus. And still, some of them were angry. They were saying that they were being admitted solely for statistical purposes. There were so many posts about it on social media. Have you ever encountered such a situation?
Of course, there were such cases. This is because the word COVID-19 scares people to an extent their nervous system can take it, whether it is a patient or his relatives, loved ones. Therefore, as my colleague said, there are those special criteria: mild, moderate, severe.
Сондықтан әріптесім айтқандай, арнайы критерийлер бар. Жеңіл, орташа, ауыр.
What did you do then, Biknur? Suppose someone wants to attack you when you visit them, intimidates you. How do you handle the situations?
Бірінші кезек
First of all, as I said before, I don't go along on these calls.
қосымша екі
There are always two paramedics accompanying me. So we ask people to be patient, to be understanding. Then we can transfer the patient to the hospital only if the patient's relatives agree.
госпитализация, яғни стационарға тасымалдаймыз.
Now, Biknur, you are a man. This might be fine with you. And you, Akjarkan, have you ever experienced anything of this kind? What did you do? Such cases are very common. This was happening, I think, because of the lack of explanatory work. Those patients with coronavirus infection that were not explained anything about the COVID-19. That's why they were taking their diagnosis so aggressively and emotionally. Anyone can be in such an emotional state. This happens because of the whole situation was unusual. The lack of information, this leads to episodes like this. When do the patients respond in such an aggressive manner? They do that when they are being told that they have this novel coronavirus, virus of an unknown origin. In this case, this is enough to become inadequate, frightened. And this is completely understandable because the person doesn't have the slightest idea where he got infected. So he expresses his anger. And this is when it's really important to explain everything to him first. What are the possible complications? Then it's important to talk to his relatives as well, to explain to them how dangerous it is to get infected and how dangerous it is for their lives. After such an explanation, the patient, now having some information, becomes concerned about his health and does not confront us. And this is the moment the patient agrees to be transported to the hospital. Thank you. Your work is not easy indeed, but we wish you all the luck. Let's only see each other on happy occasions.
Thank you too.
Special mention should be made of the work of doctors in the intensive care unit, who fought hard for the life and health of every single patient. For those people, every single life is sacred, and they do whatever they can to save it. It's indeed true that these specialists have repeatedly taken risks to save their patients. Gulnara Muratqızı, it's a fever, 39 degrees. Patient has trouble breathing. What about the blood pressure? At a time when the world was in a state of panic, shaken to its core, those heroes in white coats had to become frontline soldiers without guns as they were fighting the pandemic day and night, risking their own lives and the lives of their relatives.
It's been a while since I last called, baby, my sweetheart.
Today, the pandemic has been settled down thanks to the joint efforts of doctors who took into account the negative experiences of the first wave of the pandemic. Let's not forget that we can overcome the disease that threatens the well-being of mankind only with the help of qualified doctors. The next guest to join our studio is an intensive care doctor, Yesenay Bakhajanova. Welcome.
Hello there, thank you. Yesenay Yespimbetov, head of intensive care department of the City Clinical Hospital No. 7, Master of Medical Sciences, doctor of the highest category, has 14 years of work experience.
You all right?
I am, thank you.
So did you experience any fear? Were you scared?
When this disease appeared, this novel virus, of course, we were scared. At first, we thought it would pass easily. But later, when we got acquainted with it properly, we, the doctors, we were scared. How do we treat it? How do we help out our patients? It is not a well-known disease. There is nothing about it in the books. And it is only now that new treatments are being developed around the world to combat this novel virus.
So what is the current result of this fight with the coronavirus?
Now, thanks to the quarantine, the number of patients infected with the coronavirus in our country has decreased significantly. Severe cases have decreased in particular. As a result, the number of patients admitted to hospitals has decreased, and many infectious diseases hospitals are now closed. Modular clinics and centers are also being closed.
So how many hours per day does this intensive care doctor work?
I work 8 hours per day. Doctors who work part-time, they work 24 hours shifts.
24 hours.
Exactly, one full day non-stop.
What quality should a person possess if he wants to become an intensive care doctor, considering that you're at a front line?
First of all, if one wants to become an intensive care specialist, it is important to remember that this profession is all about balance between life and death. I can say that this is a very difficult profession, because you are the person whom the ailing patient will see in his last moments. And if you try hard enough, if you follow the procedures, you are the one who can save him from the death.
Doesn't the fact that you face death every day cause you any kind of psychological discomfort or fear?
To graduate in this specialty, you need a 3-year residency after the graduation. If you still want to become a doctor after a 3-year residency, you can continue your work. If you can't cope after those 3 years, they would just quit. If you pass this test, you can continue working.
Many doctors decided not to go home for several months when the virus broke out. What did you do?
When the first cases of virus appeared in Kazakhstan, we quarantined all the doctors, and we did not go home for 2 months. We stayed in the hospital for a month, stayed in the hotel for a month, and only then we would return home. Once the quarantine was over, so we got tested, double-checked our test results, and then came home.
Now we know that no one was ready for the epidemic. You said you were confused at first, but you may have been trained in advance to be prepared for the situation like this, right? Did you use any knowledge you got from those training sessions?
Even before the first cases of the virus appeared in our country, we had some online lessons with foreign doctors. They were online conferences, such as webinars with European and Russian doctors. I can say that it has helped for sure, but when I came face-to-face with this virus, I would say that it was very challenging. It is a very cunning virus, you know, very smart, if I may say so. Nothing works with it, nothing that was written in the books, not a single thing that was included into the protocol.
Has the situation in the intensive care unit changed since the arrival of this COVID-19 virus?
Everyone now is aware who the intensive care doctor is. Now suddenly everyone also is aware of this new term saturation. Saturation is an indicator of the body's ability to transport blood. It shows the oxygen levels in the lungs. That's why ordinary people now started to understand a bit what kind of job intensive care doctors do. Now secondly, walkie-talkies were introduced into our daily practice. They have shown great efficiency during many difficult situations. This walkie-talkie helps us when there are too many patients and phones do not work, so you end up using a walkie-talkie instead. What we did, we started to coordinate our actions through walkie-talkies. We consulted with each other on what we were doing, where we are going. I can say that the walkie-talkie helped us a lot during this COVID-19 pandemic. Many other changes are taking place now. All of them will be contributing to the treatment in the future, and they will continue to do so, I'm sure.
Was there a shortage of intensive care specialists during the outbreak?
Well, during the outbreak, there was a shortage of not only intensive care doctors, but also other doctors, medical workers in general. And of course, since many patients were being admitted to hospitals in critical condition, they were admitted to intensive care units. There was a shortage of intensive care doctors.
And what about nurses? Because we know that nurses are doctors' eyes, ears, and hands. So how was it?
The nurses also had a hard time along with doctors. These people also contributed to keeping this fragile balance between life and death. Now, frankly, a doctor can't do much without a nurse. Thanks to those nurses, we saved many patients.
It may be very difficult to wear this protective suit. We even get tired of the mask sometimes, don't we? So how often do you change it? For how many hours do you wear it?
It should be changed every 6 hours. This is how long we wear it.
Is it difficult to take off this personal protective gear?
Taking it off is the most difficult part. You must be clean when you put it on, when you suit up, and you must not infect yourself when you take it off. That's why every time you take it off, layer by layer, or when you put it on layer by layer, it is very important to proceed slowly, so that you don't catch the virus that settled on it. There is this special box for used protective suits. The main problem is that it is very difficult to wear it. You sweat enormously. After wearing it, a person sweats a lot. The reason for sweating is that it is very hot inside those clothes. They are very inconvenient for work. Nevertheless, in order to protect our lives, we endured all these because we didn't want to infect ourselves, get sick, because we are supposed to help the sick. You can't even drink water or food for 6 hours while wearing it. You can't have any kind of food without taking the suit off. It was very difficult.
Сен ондай тамақ қабылдай алмайсың. Өте қиын болды.
Your work has never been easy. We all understand that. Did psychologists work with you? Because we all know there are situations when you have to break some unpleasant news to the relatives of the deceased. How was it?
I mean, of course, we are all humans after all, breathing, living human beings. And of course, there were cases when some doctors were seeking psychological assistance. There were times when psychologists worked with them. I can't say that every single doctor required this assistance, but some did. The most difficult situation is to break the news to the relatives of the person who died of the coronavirus. They were young men and women who were extremely healthy and robust, who had never been ill in their entire lives. So most of us could not look at their relatives when we had to tell them that these young people had died. With each and every patient, you feel as if one of your 12 organs had failed. We suffer every single time we report the death of each patient to their loved ones. But since this is life, and there are other patients' lives at stake, and in order to help those patients in the future, we try to control our emotions. We try not to get too emotionally involved in those sad cases.
Келешекте басқа науқастарға көмектесу үшін біз де өзімізді қолымызға алып, әрқайсысын енді жүрегімізге қатты жақындатпай, солай айтып отырдық енді аяқ жағында.
Have any of your colleagues been infected with the coronavirus?
It did not happen in the beginning. Later, although we were taking all preventive measures, some of my colleagues got sick. There were patients among doctors and nurses. No matter how many doctors and nurses fell ill, they went to work every day and no one left the hospital. No one stayed at home. None of my acquaintances left. None of those who worked under my supervision, those who worked with me, did not leave, no matter how difficult the situation was.
This is a great deed. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your valuable knowledge, and we wish you good luck.
Thank you. Take care. I am an employee of the Almaty Police Department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Our job is to maintain public safety and order and fight crime. After the pandemic spread around the world, and once the quarantine measures were introduced, the whole burden of it fell on the police. Yes, it was not easy for us, but after all, our duty demanded that we cope with it. We handled it, so we overcame all these difficulties together. During the quarantine, we were engaged in the fight against the crime. We engaged in the crime prevention at the checkpoints, and we were in the charge of the regulation of the public safety. Hello. And now let me introduce you to the Operating Control Center of the Almaty Police Department. This is the Operational Control Center of the Almaty Police Department. As you can see, there are 14 operators on duty, as well as 3 inspectors and 1 senior duty officer. Currently, monitors are showing the CCTV live footage of Almaty streets, for example, Abay and Sifulin and Mametova streets. The main task of these 14 operators here is to send information to 3 inspectors. Then these 3 inspectors send this information to each district, for example, to our district. And if there is a crime, they send the report there and process the information here.
осы мысалы біздің райондар бар ғой, әр ауданға
Information is processed immediately, meaning that if there is anything, this information is received by 102 and then to every district.
жіберіледі. Яғни ақпарат 102-ге келіп түседі, соған байланысты әрбір ауданға жіберіліп отырады.
This is the emergency meeting room of the Operational Control Center. Here you can see that the cameras are showing live CCTV footage on the monitor. Also, the main question are usually being discussed here, the establishment of an operational headquarters during emergency situations, the definition of their main cause and purposes, the processing and interpretation of all information, and so on.
Осы жерде барлығын өңдеп ақпаратты түсіндіру.
At first, the public was indifferent to the requests voiced by the police officers regarding to the anti-COVID measures. They ignored the information provided by the media and TV about the observance of the masked regime. They didn't want to believe it. After that, our staff formed mobile groups and worked in buses and in public transport. Explanatory work was carried out in a targeted manner, and warnings were issued to all citizens on public transport, in parks and on the streets. After that, citizens who violated the mask regime, both legal entities and individuals, were fined. After the introduction of quarantine measures during emergencies, the number of crimes decreased, as most people stayed at home, but domestic crimes have increased significantly. There was an increase in domestic crimes, marital violence and family conflicts. After all, the 102 operators and the police began to receive a lot of such information through their channels of communication.
ұрыс жанжалдар сондайлар көбейді. Өйткені 102 желісіне полицияға сондай ақпараттар көп түсе бастады.
Other forms of domestic violence include, as we have just mentioned, marital discord as well as parental violence against children.
Бір-біріне деген және де әке-шешенің балаға деген зорлық-зомбылығы. Яғни ол неден болады? Ол біріншіден осы Қазақстандағы коронавирус кезіндегі жағдайдың осындай экономикалық.
So what was the reason why all these cases have suddenly increased? First of all, we believe that the outbreak of the coronavirus in the country had an emotional effect on the situation. And also, there was a decline in the economic and social well-being of the population. People became really emotional because they have suffered from insomnia. For example, in such cases, the child can be abused at home. Parent stress also affects the child. To sum up, the work of police officers and police officials during this coronavirus was extremely important, and I can say that this work was performed at high level. When we chose our profession, we committed to it with our heart's ardent desire. We are proud of our service. I am confident that the police of Kazakhstan will faithfully serve the people of Kazakhstan.
Now let's welcome representatives of another profession. These people were on the front lines during the pandemic too. Let's welcome today's program's next guests, Karibek Khairatullah and Adlit Yerlanullah. Welcome.
Hello. Karibek Birdisov, Senior Police Lieutenant, has been working in the police since 2009, Technical Specialist of the Information and Communication Department of the Almaty City Police Department. Adliet Adilbek, Senior Police Lieutenant, has been working in the police since 2018, Inspector of Information and Communication Group, Police Department of Almaty District.
How are you?
Good, I'm good, thank you.
And your health?
It is good too, thanks.
Today we invite you because we want to showcase your courage to the whole nation. So please tell us in general how difficult it was to perform your duties psychologically wise at that time.
Yes, there were different situations, all kinds of situations. Especially since the introduction of this state of emergency, there have been many incidents during the setting up of the checkpoints. It is true that after this unusual situation settled in the country, there were some difficulties when ordinary people, for example, people of working professions, those who had a job, had difficulties getting to their workplaces.
Were there any fights in their homes that they could not avoid, could not control?
Of course, there were such cases.
Adliet, What do you remember about the pandemic? Please tell us about some of your most vivid memories.
We remember a lot of very interesting events that happened during this quarantine. As you know, 27 checkpoints were set up on the borders of Almaty. Now every time a car passes a checkpoint, police officers start checking it when it stops. At that time, we noticed that 2 people in the car were trying to cross the border illegally. We had such facts.
Екі адам отырып алған болатын. Сондай фактілер болған бізде.
How did they understand that?
They were acquitted on the grounds that they had to act illegally because they did not have an entry permit.
Жүгінуге тура келдік деп түсіндірді.
Is it true that the number of law offenders increased during the pandemic?
During this time, when a state of emergency was declared and quarantine measures were introduced, many citizens were at home, most of them.
Барлық азаматтар көп барлығы былайша айтқанда үйлерінде болды, көпшілігі.
But there were definitely people who fought in their homes and went outside without following any of the quarantine requirements.
Certainly. Still, the crime rate was low. On the contrary, it was twice as low as it usually was. Crime has decreased, but as you say, the family quarrels and domestic violence cases have increased. There were also cases of internet fraud during the pandemic. For example, many people have their accounts on social media. For example, so they were ordering things online, with their social media accounts.
Мысалы, интернет солармен бірге олар сол арқылы мысалы тапсырыс береді, онлайн дейді ғой мысалы.
Have you ever caught and punished those who spread false information?
Of course we did.
Әрине бұл.
Yes, of course.
How did you trace those people? Do you have employees who specialize in IT?
Қызметкерлеріңіз бар ма?
Yes, of course. We call it cybercrime. It is a crime committed on the internet, and there are special people that deal with the crimes committed via technology.
Технология, IT технологиялар арқылы істелінетін қылмыстарды айналысатын арнайы қызметкерлер.
Question for both of you. Being a policeman is not easy. Right now, during the pandemic, you are at the forefront. What qualities do you need to have to become a successful police officer?
Адам бойында қандай қасиеттер болу керек?
Alihan Bukikhanov once said these wonderful words: serving the nation and the people is not about knowledge, but about character. Baurjan Mamushalo also said, there is no slave in one who obeys the order. In my opinion, the first and foremost, the main trait of any successful police officer should be discipline. Second, it must be a responsibility. That is, if a person is responsible for his work and is not afraid of this responsibility, then this police officer can work accurately and thoroughly in any situation. The third quality is morality. A police officer must also be patient. I believe that a police officer is a patriot of his country who protects the legal interests, rights, and freedoms of man, society, and the state.
Полиция қызметкері дегеніміз ол адамның, қоғамның, мемлекеттің заңды мүдделерін, құқықтары мен бостандықтарын қорғайтын өз елінің патриоты деп мен білемін.
Khairbek, did you dream of becoming a policeman? What motivated you to join the force?
To be honest, at first, I didn't think I would ever join the police. After finishing 3 years of Polytechnic College and completing my 1-year military service, I had a conversation with my father, and it was him who motivated me, becoming a civil servant, serving the people, joining the police force. He advised me to try this path. So it was my father's advice that motivated me. I decided to join the police forces because of my father's and family's collective wisdom.
Сол әкем ең басты ақылын айтқан болатын. Сол үйдегілердің ақылымен осы полиция қызметіне келдім.
Do you regret it?
No, I do not regret. Because sometimes at work, in different situations, in times of crisis, for example, during the quarantine, some people would say, "Are you tired? Do you think you chose the right profession?" So I always answer this with confidence. I say, I chose the right profession. After all, the police need people to carry out informational and propaganda work, those who will encourage, promote and engage people, as well as employees. After all, even in times of war, it was always been easier to work together, hand in hand, supporting each other, encouraging and inspiring each other. You can overcome any difficulty you face when you are being supported by your colleagues. Similarly, I have no regrets about joining the police and choosing this profession. We do our best at this service. As my colleague Adliat said, the most important quality in the police service should be patience and patriotism. Only then, when there is a goodness in the heart of every person, it is necessary to be able to awaken the desire to do good.
Вот. Отансүйгіштік болу керек.
to preserve, to show courage.
Әрбір адамның жүрегінің түбінде жақсылық болады, сол жақсылық істеуге, қайсарлық, батылдық істеуге, соны оята білу керек дер уақытында.
бірақ сіздер
But sometimes people don't understand your good intentions. There are so many anecdotes and jokes about police officers. Sometimes people file complaints, they complain about you. Don't you have this psychological resentment against people, thinking, why would they do this?
өздеріңізде бір психологиялық тұрғыда адамдарға реніштеріңіз болмай ма?
Жоқ, әрине,
But we are human. We are just like them. We are exactly the same human beings as those other people. Each of our colleagues, each of our employees who now work on the front line, who is not always visible at the forefront, all of them experience the same problems in their families, experience personal issues.
өзінің жанұясында, отбасында, жеке басында өзінің мәселелері болады.
In any case, they work patiently, they have their families, and still, since they have chosen this position, they have chosen it because of their patriotism, and they serve with the patience and perseverance to the very end, even if no one appreciates them.
Жаңағы ең басты отансүйгіштігіне байланысты. Осы қызметті өзі таңдап ешкім шақырған жоқ. Олар өздері таңдап келді. Өздері таңдап келгеннен кейін аяғына дейін төзімділік пен шыдамдылық.
For example, our great Mukagali Makataev said once, be patient, be patient, be patient, be patient. This life favors patience.
Ұнатады дейді.
When you hear the words of our poets and the writers, the inspiring poems of our great Mukhtar Shakhanov, you get inspired and motivated to continue working, because it gives you the strength to start your every single day at work with enthusiasm.
өзің жаңа келесі жұмысыңды тағы да бір құлшыныспен бастауға, тағы да бір күннен күнге сондай бір күш беріп тұрады.
Тамаша.
You both are so articulate. I guess you read a lot of books.
I mean, we all needed it. Indeed, literature and the history of Kazakhstan were among one of my favorite subjects when I was studying at school. These were our most favorite ones, right? I focused on them a lot.
Мен өз басым.
And what about you, Adlet?
I completely agree. I think that not only responsibility and discipline, but also intelligence should be important for police officers. For example, this year was the 175th anniversary of Abay. We read many poems by Abay Kunambayev, Mukhtar Shakhanov, Mukagali Makataev.
Makataevтің өлеңдерін оқимыз өзіміз.
Do you have any kind of competitions?
Of course, competitions are organized on a regular basis. Every year we have a Republican competition called Exemplary Policeman. It takes place in the fall annually. In September, the selection process begins, and then there will be a selection from the regional departments, and then at the national level. And then the city, nominated by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, will be visited by representatives of other cities. For example, if we win, in our city, we'll get a ticket to the national competition and go to the competition there. All policemen from regional centers all over the country will gather there and take part in the competition. There we demonstrate our skills, because the police are good not only to fight crime. We always want to show that we can be creative, that we are fond of the arts, and that there are so many talented people on the front lines.
және де алдың шепте жүре тұра сондай өнерлі адамдар бар екенін көрсетеді.
Отандастарыңызға
Do you have any appeals to your compatriots
бар ма?
in Kazakhstan?
First of all, of course, I want to say that it was difficult for many people during the pandemic. Many people do not realize that. I want to tell them, it is a temporary thing. Everything will be fine in the future.
Алда әлі бәрі жақсы болады.
Қандай жағдай болмасын, қазақ атамыз айтады ғой, жақсы сөз жарымыз.
In any case, you should remember that our Kazakh ancestors used to say, a good word is half the battle. You just have to think of the good things. There is another good saying. There is relief at the end of every difficulty. Remember this, think positively, do good things.
Жақсы күндерге жетуімізден біріншіден психологиялық тұрғыда оймен соған дайын болу керек та, соған сәйкес іс-қимыл, іс-әрекеттер жасау керек.
Жарайсыздар.
Well done. I wish you good luck in your hard work. May the success follow you everywhere.
Thank you. Bless you.
We should never forget that journalists are, along with the military people and doctors, were at the forefront of the pandemic. Today, a journalist, Alua Mohammed, came to our studio.
Журналист.
Welcome, Alua.
Hoş geldin Alua.
Thank you.
Alua Mohammed, journalist, correspondent of Information Programs Department, Khabar Agency GSC, Almaty branch. graduated from Al-Farabi Kazakh National University, journalism faculty, Master of Sociology.
Alua, how are you? Good, thank you. Have you recovered from the virus? I did. Alua, the work of journalist is not easy. You were at the forefront, disseminating information. How did the state of emergency affect you and your work? This state of emergency situation and the whole pandemic thing has brought many changes to television journalism. Why? Well, the quarantine has especially affected news programs. We have always paid a lot of attention to the quality of media content, especially on the Habar channel. We have always paid a lot of attention to the text and then to the video. You know, the business as usual was to shoot videos with high-definition filming equipment, to work with some great cameramen, to work with professional video engineers and some strong editors. Now, when the pandemic began, in order not to communicate with other people, it became a usual practice to record a video on the phone. So we were allowed to record videos for the news section on a regular smartphone or mobile phone. Say whether it's a doctor or any other person, if they say, I can't take you to my home or to work, we tell them, we understand you. Then you can please take your smartphone, put it horizontally and provide some of your information. There has never been anything of this kind before. And in case of emergency, during quarantine, it has now become our norm. During the state of emergency, we, the journalists of the news department, we worked without days off. You were active. We were active indeed. After all, people expected credible information from us. After all, this is not a normal situation. And at that time, various false information was spread. Yes, that was what I was saying. This was not a normal setting for all of us. Nothing was as usual. It was an extraordinary event, and people were confused after the state of emergency. They did not know what to expect. There was a lot of information. People did not know who to trust and how to trust. Therefore, we had to provide official, trustworthy, credible information. How did you filter this information? In the beginning, everything was unknown. How do we filter the information? Is this true? Is this false? And what does this mean? In general, the rule of thumb is the following, and it applies not only to this case, but also to other cases. How do we find our credible information? We interview an expert in a certain field. Once journalists are on the front lines, we should not show our difficulties to the people, because people need reliable information, not your problems. It's like a war situation if you look at this way. That's why Kazakhs say that we exaggerate the good and conceal the negative things. People really did not know that we didn't have enough people, that we didn't have time for anything, that we were sick sometimes. You tried not to show it. Yes, we tried not to show it. People should not know these things. And in fact, we were combing through so much information, so many stories every day. For example, 5 people had to do the work that used to be done by 20, 30 people. But this whole situation has only shown the professionalism of journalists. This is how you forge yourself as a professional. There was a shortage of medicine at that time. You remember, right? That's what happened. There were people looking for medicine day and night, for relatives, for themselves. People were waiting in lines at pharmacies. They did not keep any distance, did they? Because you needed a friendly soul, not a distance. And at that time, I was running around those pharmacies. My first story was about that. I went to the pharmacies and talked to people standing in line for several kilometers. What medicine are you looking for? They were naming the most necessary medicines at that time. There was an interesting situation when I was interviewing people and asking them what kind of medicine they were waiting for. There was one middle-aged woman. She was like 100th, 101st in the queue. What medicine are you waiting for? I was about to ask her when I realized. It was obvious from the look in her eyes and her posture that she was in a very bad condition. She said, I have a fever and my lungs are inflamed. When I looked at her, I saw that she had an X-ray film in her hand, and she had a long list of medicines, a long list of prescriptions. She was in a really bad condition. And you have recently asked other guests about fears and everything. So I didn't have this thought, oh my God, I need to stay away from her. We should go. There was no thought of such kind. I immediately turned off the camera, took that woman and led her to the pharmacy, jumping the queue. I went straight to the pharmacy manager and explained to the security, this woman is in bad condition. Please help her and find her the medicines she needs. These were the conditions we had to work in. Then it was rumored that Saumal helped the people. At that moment, many rumors like that spread around. There are people who got infected in the queue for Saumal. Yes, I was interviewing those people. I walked among them. After all, it wasn't the people's fault, right? It was about information that they were looking for. And after all, the whole population was confused. Somal's prices have skyrocketed. We used to pay 500, 600 tenge for a liter, but in some places it has gone up to 1,500, 2,000 tenge. The average cost was 1,500, 2,000 tenge. At that time when I was making that story, all I knew was that people go with their families to queue at those places at night, from 1 to 7 a.m. Not one person, but 100 people. Not only Kazakhs, but also people of other nationalities. So in order to get my story, I went there at night, and we were there. We were in line, saw everything with our own eyes, made interviews, and saw the quarantine sanitary. Measures not being followed. Yes, we were there. In general, when you make such a video feature, you think that you will include there a piece to camera. Now I thought I would make a piece to camera with freshly milked mare's milk. I thought I would drink it. But do you believe that when people wait in line for like 12 hours, they stand there and the somal was being sold to them gram by gram? No more than 2 liters per person. For some it was 1 liter, 300 grams. I didn't dare to ask for 300 grams of somal from that farm when there were so many people queuing for it. So I ended up not doing a piece to the camera. In fact, the outbreak seems to have increased the people's sympathy for each other. It has increased unity among people. Did you notice that? Yes, because I also pitched a story on this topic. We now seem to understand the value of life and the value of people. Seem to understand the value of health now. They now understand the value of health. We said that this is the age of globalization and technology, and we do not pay attention to each other, both in the family and in the workplace. We were becoming cold. Now we journalists, we didn't stay at home, but while others were isolated from each other during quarantine, many said in their stories, we prepared, I got to know my wife in a new way, I recognized a different side of my son, that he has such personality traits, that he has such qualities. For example, in one of my features, a student told the story. I used to not care much about how I spent my time. But then I dreamed of spending time with my parents, and now I'm here. I hug them all day, cook them delicious food, and I still had time to do my home assignments. I think that the people used that time a little more effectively, and they understood the value of family and humans in general. So the epidemic has brought us both harm and benefits.
Yeah.
That's true. Alua, well, now this pandemic will be remembered by everyone in different ways. How will you remember it? This pandemic will not be easily forgotten. One story I remember. I still have a heartache for that. As you may recall, it was announced on the 19th of March that the city of Almaty will be closed on the 22nd. On the same night, on the night of March 21st, 22nd, my colleague Jandos Aybaoli went live, saying that the city was closing and checkpoints had been set up. And I remember the first broadcast of the morning, broadcast on March 22nd, and I was there at the first block stations. My colleague Maral, she was the host of the studio. She was there, and I told her, "How are you, Maral? Congratulations on the great day of Nauruz." Usually on this day, we would go on air and talk about the celebrations, numerous parades, and our March traditional festivities. Unfortunately, it was a different situation. That is, usually we would declare March holiday. And on March 22nd, we called it the great day of the nation. However, on that day, the first thing I announced in the first morning broadcast of the day that the state of emergency was declared. Our doors were closed.
бергенім. Сол күнге мен
Because the situation was so instead of celebrating, instead of a holiday, we had to broadcast this kind of information. This was the first situation that broke my heart. It was raining that day because I guess nature felt just exactly the way the whole world did. But there was no other way. Thank God we have overcome many difficulties since then. It's all behind us. Let's not broadcast such information again. If we talk about March, then it should be all about the holidays, festivities, parades, and joy. I hope that from now on we will only have good news. Thank you very much, Joly. Keep creating this good content. Let's celebrate Nowruz next year in the proper manner. We salute you, our journalists, for such courage. Good luck to you. Thank you. Dear viewers, and this is it for today. We will fight this pandemic for sure. This is what we should remember today. I will see you next time on Kazakh TV. Take care.